for posterity and all that. Okay, so this week we're adding 2 more slides to our list of slides that you're going to need to know for Lab Practical 1. So 4 slides total. We started out with a blood slide, and we have the cardiac muscle slide. We've looked at those already. There are 2 more that are going to be required for this week. So this one is our artery and vein slide. And so we know from talking about in lecture that we have different types of blood vessels. Each blood vessel, to a certain extent, has a different job to do. They're all conducting blood, but they also have kind of additional functions. And so if we have different functions, then we have different structures to support those functions. So with this slide, one of your key things to do is to be able to recognize, number one, that you're looking at an artery and vein slide. We're seeing them in cross-section, so you're looking down the barrel of them. But the second thing is you got to be able to tell the difference between an artery and a vein. Okay? So what we have here is this is an artery right here, and this is a vein. So the vein, if we look at the edge of the vein, right, you can see it has kind of an odd shape to it. And that has to do with the fact that the wall of the vein, let's see if I can get that a little bit bigger. So the wall of the vein is a little bit thinner, or in some cases a lot thinner, compared to the wall of the artery. So usually when we look at our artery compared to the vein, what we're going to find is the artery is going to have a much thicker wall compared to a similar, at least on the outside, a similar sized vein. Okay, so we have a much thicker wall that we see there. Let's see if I can get that a little bit bigger. I was hoping so. Wait, drop down. That menu's right in my way. You notice that? Oh, that's really big. We don't want that, do we? Okay. So one of the first things we're looking at is we're looking at the thickness of this wall here compared to the thickness of this wall here. So the artery is going to have a thick wall because it's receiving that high pressure blood, right, from the heart. Meanwhile, the vein is going to have a relatively thin wall because it's going to be around the other side of the cardiovascular loop. So that's the first thing we're looking for. So now you figured out artery, thick wall, and vein, thin wall. Now the artery, because of that thick wall, would tend to be open, whereas the vein might be partially collapsed like you see here. Okay, it may be almost sandwiched, like you only see it open on either end and it's totally flattened in the middle. In either case, remember both of these organs, remember we talked about in lecture how each of these are organ because they are made up of more than one tissue type. Each of these organs are a hollow filled organ, right? So they have an open space in the inside, which is called the lumen. Now, in this slide, online, we can see that that lumen still contains some blood. So that's why you're seeing, instead of open white, you're seeing this remnant pink. So these are red blood cells. Every once in a while you can actually see white blood cells in there. So in your slide it may be open there, but that's the lumen. That's the inside. That's where the blood goes. Okay? Now when we look at the wall, we're going to find that each of these vessels has 3 different layers to it. So there's an externa, and the externa, let me see, we'll go some other way. The externa is going to be the external one. So in the artery, it's going to be from there to there. Okay, this is going to be connective tissue containing collagen fibers. We said that when a blood vessel breaks, this is what the blood's going to come into contact to and start the clotting cascade for that intrinsic pathway, etc. Okay, so this is the outermost layer, the tunica externa. This is the connective tissue. Then we have the tunica media, the middle layer. This is the thickest layer in the artery. So all of that is tunica media, that smooth muscle. Okay, so third layer is a very, very thin layer. Remember, it's an epithelial layer. So we said this is very analogous to the heart, right? We have an outer layer, which is relatively thin. We have a thick muscular layer in the middle, and then we have an endothelial layer that provides a lining. Remember that the blood always wants to contact epithelium. That's what it's naturally going to see, whether it's in the chambers of the heart or whether it's in arteries and veins. Okay? So that epithelial lining is going to be just right here. And in the artery, it tends to have kind of a wavy border to it. And that is because with these arteries, remember that they go through this stretching and then elastic recoil, right? So when a tidal wave of blood comes from the ventricles, that artery is going to expand and then it's going to snap back like a rubber band. So what we find is there's a lot more what we call elastin fibers in the layers of the wall of the artery. And when there's not blood shunting through it during that tidal wave of ventricular contraction, it tends to shrink back and snap back to its original size. And so when it's stretched out, this inner tunica intima or tunica interna is going to be straightened, right? But when it goes back to its original size, once that tidal wave passes by, it tends to wrinkle up. Okay? So in arteries, that tunica intima or tunica interna, that inner epithelial layer, will be wrinkled, okay, compared to a vein. So let's look at the vein up here. Vein's going to have the same 3 layers. So we're going to have out here, between here and here, we're going to have a tunica externa. Okay? Now look at this. Between here and here, I can barely put my arrow into it. Okay? In this little area here, that's going to be the tunica media. That's going to be the smooth muscle layer. And then there's going to be a single layer of flattened cells, epithelial cells, on the very inside, which is going to be our tunica intima. But we said that in the vein, right, the wall can be thin because this is all the way around the other side of the cardiovascular loop. Low pressure, doesn't have to worry about stretching and pulsing and all that type of thing. So it has a thin wall, and it doesn't do that expansion and then elastic recoil. So it tends to have a very smooth tunica intima. Okay? So if you're having a hard time looking at the thickness of the wall between the artery and the vein, and you're not quite sure, look at the tunica intima or interna and see whether it's wrinkled or whether it's smooth, and that will also help you to identify an artery versus a vein. Okay? Okay, so you need to be able to tell the difference between an artery and a vein. You need to be able to identify all 3 layers. Okay, so on the lab practical, you may actually get a pointer coming to one of these vessels, and it's going to be pointing either to the innermost layer, the middle layer, or the outer layer. And so it would ask you, name the specific vessel type, name this particular layer here. It may, if it's a deeper level question, it may actually ask you what is the specific tissue type that you find here. Like we said, like connective tissue or smooth muscle or epithelium. Okay? Okay, so that's one slide that you're looking at today. It's a pretty simple slide telling the difference between an artery and a vein. Next one is this one here. Now this one here is a lymphatic vessel. So we don't get to the lymphatic and immune system until after exam 1. But as we were talking about in lecture, this is a series of vessels that are kind of hidden in the background in between all the cardiovascular vessels. And they're doing a job of, one of their jobs is to collect excess fluid that is left in the tissues from the cardiovascular vessels. So at the capillaries, we're doing all kinds of exchange. Remember, these are the thinnest and most numerous different types of blood vessels. They have a super thin wall which facilitates this type of exchange with the tissues, including fluid like water. So when that exchange occurs, oftentimes there's a little bit that gets left behind in the tissues. And so the lymphatic capillaries that are there in amongst the cardiovascular capillaries pick up that excess fluid and start routing it back towards the heart so we can dump it back to the cardiovascular system. Along the way, it passes through these different lymph nodes, so we clean it along the way. Think about, a pool system, right? So we said, as you draw a little bit of fluid out, you run it through a series of pipes, you run it through the filter, you clean it, and then you dump it back into the main circulation. So lymphatic vessels are doing the same thing, running it past lymph nodes, maybe taking out worn out cells or bacteria or something like that, it picked up along the way in the tissues, and then dumping it back into one of the 2 different subclavian veins. So that's where it returns to the cardiovascular system. Okay? All right, so point being is that these lymphatic vessels are also routing fluid. Now the fluid in the lymphatic vessels is called lymph, but it's analogous to plasma. Okay? It's kind of the fluid components, this excess fluid. So it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. So the lymphatic vessels are conducting this fluid from out of the tissues and returning it back to the heart. Now, what's another vessel that takes fluid from the tissues and takes it back to the heart? Veins, right? So cardiovascular system, we're looking at, okay, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. So it's the venules and veins that are taking it from the tissues and routing it back towards the heart. They have a relatively thin wall, and they actually have these structural adaptations where they have one-way valves, just like the heart chambers do, or at least between different heart chambers. And so that ensures a one-way flow of this fluid back towards the heart. So, in fact, the lymphatic vessels have a very similar structure to veins. It's low pressure, low flow, if you will, and we need this assistance of these different valves along the way to make sure it's always going back to the heart. So what we see with the lymphatic vessel slide, this is the only lymphatic system resource that we use in the lab. It's this one slide. We don't have any models or anything like that. We have this one slide. You're seeing the lymphatic vessel in longitudinal section as opposed to cross section like we saw for the cardiovascular vessels. So that makes it a little bit easier, right? In fact, in our slides, I don't think we have this surrounding adipose tissue and extraneous tissue out here. It's just a channel like we see there. So you need to recognize that this is a longitudinal section of a lymphatic vessel, or basically recognize that it's a lymphatic vessel. We're not doing layers to its wall or anything like that. The only other thing we're identifying within this lymphatic vessel is the fact that this darkened area that we see here, that's one half of it. See this other darkened area right there? This darkened structure that we see right there is a valve. That's one of those one-way valves. It looks very similar to what we see in terms of atrioventricular valves, or more closely actually to the semilunar valves. Okay? So if the blood tries to come back, blood's going to go this way naturally, can push its way through. I'm sorry, in this case lymph. Okay? But if it tries to come back again, it's going to catch in these little cusps here, and it's going to drive them together, and it's going to close that valve. So it only can go back to the heart. So in this particular valve with the, or this particular vessel with the valve shaped like this, that means the heart must be this way. Okay? All right. So that's the second slide that you need to be able to identify. So you'll want to take a look at the blood vessel slide and the lymphatic vessel slide. But those are 2 out of the 4 slides. Now usually on Lab Practical we can expect at least half of the slides that we have to know to show up on the Lab Practical. We have to know 4, we're expecting at least 2, maybe 3. Okay? Okay. So questions on slides? Okay. So the next thing that we're looking at is we're looking at the blood vessels themselves. And when we look at the blood vessels themselves, we start out with this model, which is kind of the flat man or the flat guy model. It's a 3B model, same white base as we see with the big heart, okay? And there are pros and cons to this model, to be sure. It's kind of our go-to model for the different blood vessels. So you're going to see the most of this model for asking you arteries and veins on the Lab Practical compared to other types of learning resources we have. So we'll see the most of this. So I can't say for sure, but you'll probably see like 5 or 6 different stations with this model on it. Okay, so this is your main model. It's not the only one, and we have to make sure we look at other things too, like the torso models, like the Froese chart. Even things like those leg models, you can actually see arteries and veins on those leg models, or even on the arm models, right? So you can see, for instance, like the iliac artery and vein coming through the pelvis. You can see it turning into the femoral artery and vein as it comes onto the thigh, okay? But this is our go-to model, and in terms of the pros and cons of it, on the one hand, it's our simplest blood vessel model. So what they try to do is they try to kind of cut away some of the blood vessels so you can focus on the ones that you're interested in. So for instance, even in this little shot right here, we can see left side, they don't have any of the veins seen, right? They cut them, like we can see it cut right there. Meanwhile, on the right side, you can see where the veins interleave with the arteries, okay? So that's good, so you can go, oh, okay, I'm just gonna focus on the arteries. I can see them clearly here. I don't have to worry about crisscrossing veins over them. But in some cases, then, it makes it hard for you to identify the full kind of pathway for the blood vessel. Right? And remember, with these blood vessels, the names change if they pass into a new area or they split, right? It's just like roads. So if you have a road and you come to a T intersection and it turns this way and that way, it gets a new name, right? Usually that road dead ends, and now you have a different name on the road that you're turning onto, right? Same thing as well in terms of roads, especially in Mesa. It's really crazy, right? So you're driving along the 60 and you go this way, it's Mesa Road, and you go that way, it's what? If you go south on Mesa Road? Yeah, Mesa Drive. McQueen, right? So it's the same road, but if you're south of the 60, it's McQueen. If you're north of the 60, it's Mesa Drive. So at least they both start with M in that case. But then you have, a bunch of other ones where you're like, I don't know where this is, etc. Point being, sometimes when it's the same vessel passing, if it passes into a new area, it then gets a new name, okay? So, bringing it back to this model, when we're looking at some of these blood vessels, like if we're looking at this one right here, okay, you can see this blood vessel, it just ends right there because they've cut it off. Well, technically that is the left subclavian vein, right? But we can't see the entire pathway of it like we can over here on the right side. So I should probably change my color now, right? So here is the right subclavian vein, right? It tells you where it is, underneath the clavicle. This little nub right here is the left subclavian vein. It doesn't show you the whole pathway, kind of like the heart model, it just shows you a little nub. So you kind of got to get used to that in some cases it's going to cut off the blood vessel and you won't see the whole thing. Okay, so another thing that we see is, remember, these structures here associated with the heart, we've seen those already on the heart models. So likely, if we're talking about heart structures, we're going to ask you on a heart model as opposed to this model, because everything's kind of smaller here and it's harder to see. It's not saying we can't. I mean, if it's something big and clear, sure, you could ask like superior vena cava, you could ask arch of the aorta and stuff like that. But, you know, other structures in the heart, the different valves and stuff like that, why am I going to point on a model that's like really small like that when I have a better model, okay? Now, we've known when we were going through the heart model about some of these vessels. Again, superior vena cava coming up here, arch of the aorta, and they're off of the arch of the aorta, right? We have 1, 2, 3 different vessels coming off, okay? First one is brachiocephalic artery. Now, there's only one brachiocephalic artery, so there's no left or right. There's only one, so it's called the brachiocephalic artery. Next one is the left common carotid artery, which is headed up here to feed blood up to the head, the neck, the brain, etc. And this one is the left subclavian artery that's going to curve around here. It's going to go underneath the clavicle. It's going to head towards the left arm. Okay? Okay, so we know that already from the heart model. But now we're seeing other extensions as we follow these out. So for instance, this brachiocephalic artery, right underneath here, it branches into these two, into this one here and this one here. So if it branches, it gets a new name. So this is the right subclavian artery. This is the right common carotid artery. So if we see it up here already, it's branched. It's already something new. So you can't go calling it brachiocephalic artery anymore. You can only call it brachiocephalic artery right down here. Okay? So that's something to remember. And sometimes the numbers on these get a little screwy. Like the table will reference a number for the brachiocephalic artery. I can't remember what it is, but some of the models don't have the number written on them. That doesn't matter. I mean, it would be helpful, but you guys know brachiocephalic artery. It's that very first one on the right-hand side of these 3 branches. So remember what you've learned so far, right? So there's brachiocephalic artery, right common carotid, right subclavian artery. So right common carotid artery and left common carotid artery, they're called common because, like in a room in a house or something like that, like if you share a house, you have your own bedrooms and then you have a common area like the family room or something like that where everybody congregates. Same thing here in terms of common carotid arteries. So these are going to split. There is one that goes along the lateral side of the head, which is called the external carotid artery. And then there's going to be one that actually heads into, it comes in here and then it sneaks underneath, and it feeds into the brain. Okay? It goes through that carotid canal that you learned as a whole on the inferior surface of the skull. But we can't see that very well. Okay? So we can't see that internal one, but we can definitely see the external one going to the side of the head. So if we were going to tag it up here, this would be external, in fact, left external carotid artery. If we're tagging it down here before the split, this is called the left common carotid artery, because again, we have all this blood in one place and then it's going to split afterwards. So this is a common area. Okay? Okay, so we have common carotid arteries. Now, in most cases around the body, you have analogous veins that run similar pathways to the arteries. It's not always the same, but many times it is. So for instance, subclavian vein and subclavian artery, etc. Right? But sometimes it gets a little bit wacky. So we have common carotid arteries. We don't have any common jugular veins. We definitely have jugular veins. There's an internal one that's right here. And then there's an external one that is cut off from the model. Oh, that is not good, right? This is where they go a little bit too far in terms of oversimplifying the model to where it's anatomically inaccurate. So there is an additional external jugular vein that goes over here, and an external jugular vein that goes over here in parallel with the internal one. Okay? So this one, which is a bigger diameter, is the internal jugular vein, and in this case the left one, and then over here running in parallel with it would be the external jugular vein. So what that means is on this model you can only see the internal jugular veins on the left and the right side. Okay? You can't see the external ones. The Froese chart at the front of the class, which we'll pull down later on in lab, it is a little bit more daunting because it has all the different branches, etc. So it looks very complex, but at least it's anatomically correct. And you can see the large internal jugular veins in here, and then separate external jugular veins out here. And they never meet, so there's no common jugular vein like we see with the artery. Okay? Okay, so these big ones here are internal jugular veins. All right, other things that we see here. Superior vena cava, we had that one, right? So this is SVC right there. And then there are two branches coming into it, one off the right side and one off the left side. So this one is the left brachiocephalic vein, okay? So this whole long one here is the left brachiocephalic vein. This little extension right here is the right brachiocephalic vein. It's very, very short, especially on this model. It's easier to see this right brachiocephalic vein on the heart models because we can see the two branches coming in and draining into that superior vena cava. So we wouldn't ask you that right brachiocephalic vein here because it's too hard to see. Left one's not bad because it goes all the way across here. Right one's not very good. It's very short. Okay? Okay, other things that we see as we follow the subclavian vein down. Now remember, these are veins, so technically they're going back this way, right? They're draining blood back to the heart. But we're kind of following them out just because sometimes it's easier to start with the simpler, bigger things and then go smaller. So subclavian vein. Then notice, there's a junction. It splits, that means it gets a new name, right? So through here, in the armpit region, what's the name of the armpit region? The axilla, right? So this is the axillary vein. This is where you spray your axe if you're some stinky freshman guy, right? So this is the axillary vein right there, okay? A lot of people, they go, it's auxiliary. Not auxiliary. It's not like an extra one, like an auxiliary generator. It's axillary because it's in the armpit, okay? So this is the axillary vein. This one over here is called the cephalic vein. So the cephalic vein is going by the head of the humerus, so that's where it gets that head reference, okay, cephalic. So this is the cephalic vein going over here. Then we come down here, oh darn it, branches again. So it branches again, it gets new names. The branch that we see coming here towards the humerus is called the brachial vein. The branch that is staying here, more medial, is called the basilic vein. So it's spelled B-A-S-I-L-I-C. So you'll see that in the lab manual. So this is the basilic in here. The brachial is in the middle. And then we have the cephalic that's along the lateral side. Okay? So again, it's not always in parallel with the arteries, but it's just a good example of if it branches, it gets a new name. And in some cases, like in this model, it actually cuts it off, so you can't see the full pathway of the brachial vein, but you still do need to know it. Okay? Other things. One other thing before we leave this view of this model. The numbering system that you see in the table does get a little bit weird. When we're referring to the left and the right common carotid arteries, the numbering gets a little bit weird. So right in here it says 18, which is fine for the right common carotid artery. And then right in here it says 19, which is fine for the left common carotid artery. But the table says right, so you got to cross off right for 19 and put left. And then it gets wackier still because it said 19 down here, and if we follow it up, now all of a sudden right here it says 18 again. You're like, what? Right brachiocephalic was 18. We had it right down here, or correct down here, that it was 19. And then somehow somebody got lazy and wrote 18 back up here again. So again, don't forget your schooling. This is right. This is left. They're both common carotid arteries. So this is the right common carotid artery. This is the left common carotid artery, regardless of some of those typos that we see either in the table or on the model itself. Okay? That's always something that's a little bit confusing. All right, last one. When we get down further, right, here's the diaphragm. So this is going to be a separation of the thoracic cavity up above and then the abdominal cavity down below. So for instance, that aorta, that's one of our examples where as it goes through different regions, it gets different names. So we've got ascending aorta, arch of the aorta, descending aorta, and then when it's going posterior to the heart, like we see in the white heart model, that's called the thoracic aorta. It's in the thoracic cavity. Once it gets inferior to this diaphragm, now it's abdominal aorta instead. So that's what we see here. That's abdominal aorta. Now, of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, right? Anytime we make rules, there's always like, not everything. Look at this thing here. What's this big blue one? We were talking about it, right, Lorraine? What's this? Inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava, it starts right here, and it has the same name all the way until it dumps into the right atrium. So that's easier. But this is the inferior vena cava that we see right there. And in the next week or so, we should have some time to look at our human cadaver that we have stored here. And we'll look at these vessels in the human cadaver, if you so choose. And you can actually see the structural difference between these massive blood vessels. So for instance, the inferior vena cava ends up lying flat because it has a thinner wall because it's a vein. Meanwhile, the abdominal aorta has some spring to it. It actually is still kind of elastic. It sits up, and you can press the finger on it, and you can flatten it, and it will have this elastic recoil and open up again. So it's got a thick enough wall to do that. Okay, so just a couple things in terms of just clearing up confusion as we're looking down here. This first branch, there's a first branch off of the abdominal aorta right here, and it's called the celiac trunk. So the celiac trunk, like the trunk of a tree, is going to have branches coming off of it. So this is the celiac trunk. Okay, celiac effectively means abdominal area or abdomen. Okay, so celiac trunk comes up, and then there is 1, 2, 3 arterial branches coming off of it, like a tree. This one over here is going to the liver, so this is the hepatic artery. This one up here is going to a stomach that they have removed because the stomach's a little bit more anterior. So this is going to be a gastric artery, this red one that you see up here. Technically, there's a right and a left gastric artery and all this stuff. All you need to know is gastric artery, okay? And then this one over here is going to this organ, which is the spleen. So that's the splenic artery, okay? But this little stump that we see here, trunk, that's the celiac trunk. So the celiac trunk is just this section here. Once it branches, it gets new names, okay? It branches off the aorta. So it is its own blood vessel. It's an example of what we call an elastic artery, one of the first arteries that have to do this big stretching like we talk about. It's off of the abdominal aorta. It's the most superior branch of the aorta in the abdomen. Then we have the superior mesenteric, which comes off right there, and then the inferior mesenteric, which comes off down there. Plus the renal, which come across like this. Okay? All right, so that one's a little bit confusing in terms of those 3 branches. Number 1, because the celiac trunk is very short. And number 2, the number in the table and the number on the model for the gastric artery, the number is like way either over here, I can't remember, or over here by the vein. So it looks like it's labeling a blue vessel when we know these systemic arteries are red. Okay, so don't get confused. This is gastric artery, hepatic artery, splenic artery. Okay? Okay, so we can also see as we work our way down the limbs, you can see things like our brachial artery. Here's our basilic vein again. Our brachial vein, remember that was cut off. Here's our cephalic vein going over here. See this one running a diagonal right here? It doesn't have a number. This one is the median cubital vein. So when you're donating blood or something like that, this is the vein that they commonly draw from. It's on your list, but there's no number on it on the model. So we can't put a number in it, but you should know that that's the median cubital vein. It's blue vessel going through the cubital region, right, in the elbow. So it's right there. Other things, when we see these going down to the lower limb, right, when they split, they get new names. So these are common iliac arteries and veins. We have another split, we get a new name. This is internal iliac, external iliac. For this one, as it continues from the pelvic cavity and it pops out onto the thigh like we see here, now it gets a new name. This is external iliac in here. This is femoral out here. Femoral artery and femoral vein. Unfortunately, notice right here and right here, darn it, they cut off our femoral veins. So you only have this little nub like you see there, but this one, which remains, is called the great saphenous vein. It's on the medial side of the lower limb. So you do have to know great saphenous. Their whole idea was, oh, if we put the femoral there, people won't be able to see the great saphenous behind it, so we're going to cut it off. So the femoral veins are up here, This is the great saphenous vein on the medial side of the thigh right there. And it goes all the way down towards the leg. Okay? So varicose veins can be lots of different veins, usually of the lower limb. It's where those valves, like we were talking about, actually break down. So the valves are supposed to keep escorting the blood back to the heart. And if those break down, then the blood can kind of pool. There's always blood pressure pushing it around the loop, but it allows it to pool more in those veins. And so because of that, they tend to stretch and get bigger diameter. They also tend to get a little bit longer, so they get really windy, and they just tend to stick out a little bit more because that blood is in there longer than it should be. So that can be anywhere. We usually find it in the lower limb. Yeah.
Oh, but it's not just the...
It's not just great saphenous vein. No, you can find them all over the place. I have one on my left foot on top of my foot. But usually lower limb because of the gravity. And for people that end up on their feet a long period of time, that's just extra wear and tear on those veins. Yeah. Okay? So that may be more than you wanted to know about what you need to know about the blood vessels, but at least it irons out, again, some of the weird things about the models and then gives you an idea about what to expect. So you're starting out with this 3B flat guy model. That's your basic one. But once you get comfortable with that one, okay, and hopefully that will come, you do want to branch out to the torso models and the Froese chart at the front. Now, they're not going to have a lot of those, but we can expect like at least one station on the Froese chart where we can see these systemic blood vessels going to and from the body. And the torso models, the 3/4 size torso models, are also good for seeing those same blood vessels going through the chest cavity, right, the thoracic cavity, as well as the abdominal pelvic cavity. And even you can see it going down to the thigh in terms of those femoral arteries and veins, and even going to the arm like the axillary, etc. Okay? So that means we'll have, we could have 1 or 2 stations with a torso model. Again, just ask you, name this vessel, name that vessel. So as you go through, remember, systemic ones are going to have the characteristic red arteries and blue veins. But if you're doing a pulmonary circuit, if you're doing umbilical arteries and veins, they're going to be opposite in terms of their coloration. But remember, when you're labeling these on lab practical, always make sure that you put artery and vein, because that's part of the name, right? So there's a subclavian vein and there's a subclavian artery. So you want to make sure you put artery or vein so you get full credit. Likewise, if you're getting really desperate and you have no idea what it is, go with the color and at least put artery or vein, because then you can get half credit, right? That's half the name. That's something. Okay? Okay. So there is your introduction to blood vessels and what you have to know this week.